Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm here with Dr. Hector Garcia. He is a clinical psychologist specializing in the treatment of combat-related PTSD. He's assistant professor at the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Texas Health Science Center at San Antonio. He has published extensively on the treatment of PTSD in combat veterans, masculine psychology in the aftermath of war, the evolutionary roots of political partisanship, and the interplay between religious practice and psychopathology. He is also the author of Alpha God, The Psychology of Religious Violence and Oppression, and the more recent book, Sex, Power, and Partisanship: How Evolutionary Science Makes Sense of Our Political Divide. And we're going to focus our conversation today on this last book. So, Dr. Garcia, thank you a lot for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Ricardo.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Okay, so let me ask you first, perhaps, to introduce people to the book. What is the basic premise of it? And I'm going to read just a quick citation there, but even before I get into that, could you please expose what is the basic premise?
Political behavior can be irrational, and it can be volatile. It's often emotionally charged, and it can be confusing. I mean, so often we watch what's happening, irrespective of what part of the world you come from, irrespective of where you lie on the political spectrum. I think many of us have had the experience of just watching the political spectacle on the news and just being perplexed and what is happening. It's so raw and emotional and unbridled sometimes. And I think the usual political discourse falls short of explaining where all this comes from, because it tends to focus on surface level phenomena. So we're going to talk about the evolutionary sciences, how these fit into to these topics. But I love them for what they're able to clarify. They, as you know, you've been covering this topic, I've noticed, for some time. And they're so good at explaining the ultimate reasons for things, a like, a dislike, a policy preference. Why in the United States, half of the country, along with apparently the rest of the world, can be repelled by the words of their president, and the other half can really be inspired by this very same person. And you know, in fact, many of them see that person as having been directly appointed to his post by God himself. I mean, that is a very big contrast. So I seek to explain, using these sciences, what is political partisanship? Where does it come from? And why does it have such a gendered feel about it? You know, political conservatism across the world has a kind of masculine feel about it. It tends to be more hawkish in its foreign policy, more territorial. So in the United States, there's this big debate about build the wall to separate the U.S. and Mexico. And conservatives are largely supporting this. And it tends to be focused on controlling women's reproductive behavior. All this is very old. All this ties into the pressures of our evolutionary past and our reproductive strategies. And you know, bringing this up to the surface for examination is important to help us understand how to form more cohesive societies. So
yeah, would you say that perhaps you've also written the book to try to get a better understanding of where the political divide comes from, and also perhaps at the present moment why we have such a political polarization across the globe?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you know, these polarizations are not new to the present time. You know, I mean, they've been happening in one form or another ever since we had civilizations. And they've been at the heart of when civilizations collapse from the inside. And I even talk about how they come from a much more primitive place, just managing the primate dominance hierarchy. Because look, we are social animals. We are social animals, and interestingly, there are people who have a lot of discomfort at that very thought, but we're social animals and we've lived in dominance hierarchies for our entire history as a species. And much of the struggles you see between the left and right are about the history of managing, negotiating our position on the hierarchy and all the implications that has for our reproductive fitness. So.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's very interesting. We're going to get into the sort of political divide coming from sex differences, let's say. But one thing that immediately came to my mind when you were referring to that side of things is that back in 2016, during the US elections and the campaign, I guess that Donald Trump, for example, really presented himself as a sort of dominant male in the social hierarchy, right? Sort of an alpha male. And that really goes along the preferences of conservative people, right?
Oh, yes. This is, so it wasn't only this election. So there's research looking at the past at least a 300-year span of presidential elections. And I'm sure this is probably consistent around the world. I'm not aware of other research examining this, but the larger of the two candidates won in almost all of these elections across 300 years. And in every instance, both candidates were larger than the average US citizen. There is a very ancient pull to look towards larger, more physically formidable leaders, because that's who we seek alliances with. And that's especially in the very fraught, very dangerous environments in which we evolved our political psychology. Even though today there's no way that a president is literally going to get our back in a fight, but this resonates. And I don't know if you watched the debates or anything like that, but it was so people were bragging about their fighting prowess. It was really exaggerated and kind of bizarre, I think. So Ben Carson was one of the run-ups, one of the potential candidates, and he was bragging about going after people with bricks and rocks. He was bragging about this. Another candidate, Jim Webb, on the Democratic side, was bragging about having killed an enemy soldier in Vietnam. I mean, why does this happen? Trump went out of his way to accentuate how big he was compared to his candidates. He would call George Stephanopoulos a small, Marco Rubio small. Anybody who was his perceived enemy, they're small, I'm big. So this is very old. This is very ancient. We have a draw to that.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk more specifically about the evolutionary basis of that kind of behavior, because in the book you basically present conservative politics as a male-centered approach to politics and liberalism as a more of a women-centered approach to it, right? So could you tell us basically perhaps what are some of the main differences that we have to take into account between men and women to try to get a first understanding of where this comes from?
Well, a good place to start, and first let me start off by saying, look, it's not a perfect correlation. There are many, many millions of conservative women and many, many millions of liberal men. But look, a lot of this is tied to our endocrinology. So higher testosterone men are less empathic. They make poorer nurturers. They share less, and they're better at enacting mating strategies that are short-term and numerous, right? A shotgun blast to mating, which fits in with kind of a predominant male strategy that we see around the world, which I'm sure we're going to unpackage. Whereas lower testosterone men are more empathic. They make better nurturers. They're more interested in rearing offspring, and these are all characteristics of women and liberal men. I think one thing that I talk about is, to put this all into context, we have to understand what it was like in the lives of our ancestors, what it was like living in these environments. First of all, they're pretty dangerous. I mean, we take it for granted now that there are not large predators, in our neighborhoods ready to consume us, right? But not only that, the outside tribe, the dangers from outside tribes were incredibly high. We can deduce this from the archaeological record, looking at all the massacre sites, and by examining contemporary foragers who have an incredibly high murder rate. And it's usually men that get targeted. So a common strategy for men to gain reproductive fitness was to form coalitions, raid the neighboring tribe, kill all the men, kill all the male offspring, and take the women as their spoils of war. Well, males have an incentive to do that. We see something similar among chimpanzees, because in engaging in that, they can reproduce at a much higher rate than if they didn't engage in that behavior. So this was a process of sexual selection. Women wouldn't have the same advantage, right? It wouldn't benefit women to tear into the rival tribe, kill all the women, and mate with as many as men as possible. So our political psychology bears the scars of that behavior. Let's take, for example, the right-wing authoritarianism scale. This was a scale that a team of Berkeley scientists were trying to develop to help us understand what in the world gave us Hitler, and how do so many people follow this, the Nazi regime blindly and unquestioningly. Later developed by a Canadian psychologist, Robert Altemeyer, and basically this instrument has three factors. One factor is the tendency to follow authority, kind of blindly, cede control up to authority figures, which for a lot of our past were usually big, dominant, sometimes even loud men, right? Conformity, social conformity, like doing what the other person next to you is doing, and aggressing against outsiders. Well, when we think about this conforms like lockstep with the social organization of the military. This has a militaristic utility about it. Because in the military, you cede authority up the chain of command. If you don't, you're going to get slaughtered on the battlefield, right? You can't have decisions be democratic on the battlefield. You do what the other person is doing. I mean, militaries are all about conformity, and partially because it helps coordinate actions, and aggressing against the outsider. So when you think about it, I mean, this serves this male function of conducting raids on the outside tribe or defending against them. But this is also kind of the underlying psychology of the political right across the world.
Mm-hmm. So there's a lot there to unpack. Let's start with this. Perhaps because going back to what you said at the beginning, we're talking here about averages, both in terms of behavior that men and women tend to exhibit, and so in terms of sex behavioral differences, right? But also on the other end, we're talking about averages in terms of the behavior or the preferences that people both from the conservative and the liberal side of the political spectrum tend to exhibit, right? These are all averages.
They're all averages. You have to think probabilistically. I mean, there are people who are liberally minded who may show some characteristics that I talked about on the right, and vice versa. But these strategies are adaptable too. That's important to know. So yeah, it's not like we are political automatons that just behave in a way that just is directly tied to our genes with no say in the matter. But these strategies can change depending on the circumstance. So for example, after the 9/11 attacks, people in New York City, liberals, took a more conservative turn. They scored higher on right-wing authoritarianism, which shows that, look, this has an adaptive value. It helps us coalesce look inward to the tribe and say, how are we going to defend ourselves? So there's some flexibility there. Yeah, sure. And that's a really important thing to emphasize, especially for people who don't have a grounding in evolutionary science, because I think that's something that people tend to fear. Like if I give up, if I admit to some influence on my behavior from my genes, am I conceding freedom to my genes? But I think that's not necessarily the case.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I guess there are two other things here. The first one would be that both of these strategies, the male-centered strategy and the female-centered one, I mean, they were both valuable during our evolutionary history, because, I mean, for the males, I guess that it would be crucially important for us to have males in our societies, particularly to protect the females from other males, both from within the group and from other groups, and also to protect the infants. And on the side of females, we would really need a sort of someone that is more empathic and that cares more about other people, really to have someone that would be more predisposed to rear the children or to help rear them, because we also have had a lot of cooperative breeding during our evolutionary history, right? So, I mean, people nowadays, because we live in these affluent societies, we tend to think of things related to masculinity, let's say, like violence and aggressiveness, as negative aspects of human nature, let's put it that way. But I mean, evolutionarily speaking, those were also important aspects in human societies, right?
They were, and I, the main three pressures that I unpackage in this book is the pressures of germs, of outside tribes, the violence from outside tribes, and of rearing, human offspring into maturity, which is an enormous undertaking. We spend so much time in dependency. So having a nurturing, empathic, subset of our society on both men and women's side was essential to that enterprise as well. But I often ask the question of how much do these behaviors still serve us now that we are affluent? So let's consider another kind of foundational instrument used to look at the underlying psychology of political conservatism: social dominance orientation. Mm-hmm. So social dominance orientation is basically measures the extent to which you want your group to have more than the other group, right? So in competition for resources, that kind of mentality helps, right? That is what's going to motivate, and men score way higher on this than women across the world, across religions, across political systems, across systems where women have lots of rights and women have few rights. So this really speaks to, like, what does this benefit men to have this mentality? It does, because it benefits men. Reproductively speaking, it benefits men to want more than their rivals, because their genetic fitness is based on that, right? They could increase their genes, their offspring exponentially by wanting more and getting more than their rivals. Let's take one example of that. The Guinness Book of World Records for the most offspring goes to a Moroccan sultan, I think in the 1700s, mm-hmm. Named Ismail the Bloodthirsty. That was what he was named. That's what he was nicknamed. 500 concubines and 888 children. Imagine that.
Well, I thought it was Genghis Khan, but perhaps.
Genghis Khan, so there's a huge swath of Asia that is tied directly to Genghis Khan, but the Guinness Book of World Records has Ismail as on the top of all of this. So, how did he achieve this windfall of reproduction? by raiding the outside tribes, taking all their riches, taking all their resources, by having more than them, by fortifying his cities with all those resources and feeding his army so that he could have more. This isn't an egalitarian enterprise, right? So to answer your question, yes, male aggression, male territoriality, that all served a purpose. It protected us from the raids of the outside tribes. But it also is tied to this reproductive greed, because was Ismail really protecting his city by doing this? Maybe, but he was also accumulating wealth and women. In fact, when we look at men in the research lab, this is astounding, I think. Men with higher endogenous testosterone share less in laboratory games. Men who are injected testosterone share less. They show less egalitarian attitudes. So all of this ties to reproduction. So yes, it had a protective function, but we may question today, do we want to put limits on that drive for inequality? In the United States, we have billionaires that pay zero in federal income tax. So that is where this psychology has ended up.
Mm-hmm. So at a certain point there, I think you've alluded to what people in evolutionary psychology and other evolutionary sciences refer to as evolutionary mismatch. That is the fact that today we live in societies and environments that are so different from the ones we evolved in, that perhaps some of the behaviors or predispositions that we have no longer really serve us at least that well. So I'm just going to read a quote from your book here that I think represents this, and then you will tell me if it really does or not.
Right.
So right at the beginning you say, what I will show you in this book is that the difficulties we face forming cohesive societies in the modern era reflect psychological adaptations with a simple, ancient purpose: keeping our ancestors alive in savagely dangerous environments. So you're really referring to evolutionary mismatch here, or not?
I think we have to question, how much of these impulses continue to serve us today. So let's take, for example, our propensity to feel fear. So when you look at our sensitivity to certain kinds of stimuli, our fear sensitivity, it falls on the natural curve. Some of us are very sensitive to a wide variety of fears, and so most of us are kind of in the middle, and some people are on the far end that don't really fear very much. So when we use political orientation to predict where one falls on this natural curve, it maps on almost perfectly with our, so in other words, those who fear a lot tend to be more politically conservative. Those who fear much less tend to be politically liberal. And I think it's important to explain it with that directionality in mind, because we have evolved the capacity to fear, millions of years before we ever had such a thing as political orientations. So one type of fear is fear of germs. Mm-hmm. Conservatives across the world are more sensitive to they tend to have greater fears of germs than political liberals.
So that connects with the emotion of disgust, like right, and with things like, for example, pathogen disgust and sexual disgust, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So so researchers have designed these really clever measures, kind of having people rate how much would you be disgusted by the thought of eating monkey meat or seeing an unflushed stool in the toilet, stuff like that. And people rate that, how disgust sensitivity, right? So people on the conservative end tend to be more fearful of germs. And they also tend to be more fearful of new people, outsiders.
Right.
So xenophobia Whereas liberals tend to be more xenophilic, so more interested in new people, more inclined to engage in world travel, more likely to speak more than one language like you. Everything down to more inclined to eat at an ethnic food restaurant, a restaurant outside of your culture, something like that. So to answer your question, in our evolutionary past, it made sense to fear germs and even outsiders because they were the biggest vectors of disease, right? I mean, back when we were vulnerable to things like the common cold or the flu, if a newcomer came in carrying a disease that we didn't have immunity for, that could wipe out our entire tribe. So it was evolutionarily sensible to have a prejudicial psychology, right? Not only for the fear of being raided by the outside tribe and slaughtered, but because of disease. But back then, we didn't have anything resembling vaccines or antibiotics. We weren't aware of this invisible universe around us of microbiology that we know about now. We do have those things now, right? We do know about basic hand washing, and we do have vaccines. So I mean, does that prejudicial psychology really serve us today? That's a question that I want people to ask themselves, particularly as we're moving towards a globalized culture, a globalized community of nations, whether we want to or not. We're heading that way anyway. So how much does it serve us?
And do you in any way connect this literature about, for example, disgust sensitivity and xenophobia to other literature that explores the differences in psychological traits between liberals and conservatives? Like, for example, when it comes to the Big Five, if I remember correctly, I think that liberals tend to score higher in openness to experience and agreeableness, for example, and the conservatives score higher in conscientiousness or something like that.
Yeah, there are some scales in the Big Five that map onto political orientation, and openness to experiences is probably the most robust. So there's an idea that openness to experience enabled us to migrate to new lands, right? Because you're more open and interested in other people, and we needed to do that. We needed to do that to explore new environments, to capitalize on new environments and the resources within them, to interact with new people, to avoid inbreeding, to learn new technologies that the outside tribe may have, to engage in trade. So openness to experience would facilitate that. Being close to experience, you're more likely to stick at the camp, and less likely, on average, to do that. So that is the idea that is postulated behind, why liberals tend to be more open to experience and xenophilic and travel more, that kind of thing, and the opposite largely for conservatives.
But I mean, we're talking about all of these psychological phenomena, mental phenomena, and I guess that it is important also for people to really know that most of these things at least operate at a subconscious level, and we're not aware of at least of the motivations behind our behavior that come from our evolutionary past, let's say.
Yes, and that's true. I mean, I saw you had Lita Cosmides on for one of your shows, and what she and John, her husband John Tooby, called is instinct blindness. So for the most part, we're not aware of our impulses, right? We don't have conscious awareness of our evolved psychology. It's under the radar of our consciousness. So we may have a desire for a sexy partner, right? Or we may have love for our children, but we don't often consciously think of, okay, this is going to help perpetuate my genes across the ages. We don't necessarily think of that when we're loving our children. It's like, I'm loving my genes in this child. It's just, this is unconscious. But, this idea of instinct blindness has crucially important social implications, civil implications. And one of the things I stress is that if you don't understand your evolved psychology, especially your evolved political psychology, others who understand it are going to use it to manipulate you. Right. And we see that in the political spectacle here in the United States. So, and I can give some examples of that, but the idea is that, when you bring this up for examination, and you can make better choices. You can say, look, and earlier I mentioned people worry that, acknowledging some influence over our behavior is giving up freedom. That couldn't be more wrong, because the more you know of your evolved impulses, the more, not less likely, you're able to make better choices, more conscious choices, more rational choices, more intentional choices about, which one of these serve us and which one of these don't. So I think it's really important. But if you like, I'll give you an example of how these impulses are used to manipulate us, because political analysts, the ones consulting with our political candidates, whispering in their ears, so to speak, telling them what to say, they know this research, I guarantee you. So it sounds like you follow a little bit of politics in the United States. So during the 2018 congressional elections, mm-hmm. there was this curiously timed migrant caravan coming up from Central and South America, marching ominously towards the border. There was a lot of coverage of this on conservative news outlets. Mm-hmm. And, after the elections, the coverage just stopped. But what was really being plugged is that these people could be carrying disease. Right. Maybe even smallpox. Fox News aired a segment, claiming that. Well, smallpox has been eradicated, but that doesn't matter. If you are on the more fearful end of the natural curve, that is going to resonate with you, right? And you're going to take that to the voting booth, and you're going to take that to those most strongly, talking about immigration and building a wall to separate us, to protect us, and perhaps all the other policies that political faction brings along with it. So this gets manipulated, and so we need to know this psychology. Others do.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I guess that another problem here is that most people, when they're exposed to this sort of knowledge that comes from science, and particularly when we're talking about the behavioral and cognitive sciences, and we're referring to things that come from our evolutionary past and that we might refer to as innate or as innate proclivity, something like that. People sometimes, and particularly the liberals, let's say, they tend to be a bit fearful of the possibility of people using this information to make sort of a naturalistic fallacy and say, oh, for example, if people are like this, if men behave like this and women like that, then this is what we should consider to be good behavior on the part of both sexes, and perhaps if they take it to the extreme, maybe women should go back to the kitchen or something like that, because they have no place in men's professional environments or something like that. So I mean, but this is in fact, as I said, a fallacy, right?
Sure, and I think the way that fallacy is committed on the left and right are pretty distinct. So, like you said, the left tends to make this sense to sound like, well, war is undesirable, So therefore, we can't possibly have an inclination for it. Even scholars in the evolutionary sciences make this fallacy. Gender inequality is undesirable, so there can't possibly be sex differences. That research must be a priori false. On the other hand, you might have conservatives, thinking, well, because there are sex differences, that justifies gender inequality. So a lot of the ways these fallacies are committed has to do with what I mentioned earlier. How do we navigate the primate dominance hierarchy, right? And one of the things I argue is that liberalism is in many ways a psychological strategy to keep from falling down the hierarchy or rising up, and that's important because where you are in the dominance hierarchy often is related to access to resources that are critical for our genetic fitness: food, mates, territory, things like that. So liberals tend to be much more about policies that level the playing field, that keep the dominant individuals from hoarding resources or women or whatever, for impinging on our evolutionary fitness. So equal pay for women, affirmative action, checks and balances on those in authority. Whereas conservatives tend to be much more about the status quo, about maintaining that dominance position. So, and that can shift, right? That can shift depending on where you are on the dominance hierarchy.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I guess that we have one more controversial topic here, at least, and I will take the opportunity to present this question, then to move on to another topic that is related to it, that is the fact that these things that we're talking about, even the ones that we consider negative, particularly perhaps the ones coming from a male-centered approach, and maybe feminists would refer to these nowadays as toxic masculinity, like dominance, aggression, violence, and things like that. I mean, we've already talked before in the interview about the fact that they were also valuable strategies to have, at least on the part of some people that were part of our human societies during our evolutionary history. But the other part of it that is controversial, at least for modern people perhaps, is that men who exhibit these traits, I mean, they are also targets of sexual selection, right? These traits that men exhibit. And so women, at least during most of our evolutionary history, really tended to prefer men that exhibited these sorts of behavior, right?
Well, put simply, in a violent, competitive environment, if you're a female, you're going to want traits in your male offspring that are designed for success in that kind of environment. Right. Because timid, shy, submissive males are not going to perpetuate your genes, and sons have a much greater capacity to spread a woman's genes than daughters do. This is what's referred to as the sexy son hypothesis. So in those kinds of environments, you want to mate with the most domineering, aggressive, within certain limits. Generally speaking, we have to clarify that this isn't just a black and white kind of approach to reproduction. It can be very complex, but that can have a selective advantage in your sons. Oh yeah, you're absolutely right.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that this also leads us to another problem here, that is the fact that I guess across the world nowadays, and historically speaking also, men have for like close to 100% of societies and political structures, let's say, they have been at the top for most of the time. And I mean, this leads us to what we tend to call patriarchy. So, I mean, because men tend to be the sex that really is motivated to escalate dominance hierarchies and power hierarchies, because as we said just now, those traits would be the ones that women would prefer and select for. I mean, would it be possible for us in any way to say that a patriarchy, and by the way, if you could give us also perhaps a better definition of patriarchy here, but that it would be somewhat natural to have patriarchy in human societies?
Is it natural? Oh, I don't know. I mean, we do seem to be drawn to you know, male leaders who are big. But you know, the interesting thing is more so in times of war. In times of peace, we tend to prefer different kinds of leaders. You know, at times where social harmony within the clan is more important, you know, women tend to contribute to that. So yeah, so you know, that patriarchy can be a loaded term, but I tend to focus on abuses of power because of the implications that they have for human suffering, and within this male dominated or male centric approach to governance, you know, we do see abuses of power if they're not checked. And you know, and in many ways, you know, government is designed to keep our most, you know, base impulses in check. That's what it's designed for. So yeah, I think there's some value to asking where this all comes from. Once again, how much does this really serve us, and what is it really? Where does this all come from?
Right, and I guess that perhaps this aspect of patriarchy is interesting to explore also because most of the rules in society that men created and then that were crystallized in systems of law, I mean, many of them at least were created to serve the interests of men. For example, when it comes to mating and sexual control over women and other things like that, right?
Yes. Yeah, and I think that's probably a good example to maybe better answer your question. So let's talk about the fear of cuckoldry. So the term comes from the cuckoo bird. It's this notorious little bird that engages in a practice called brood parasitism. So what it does is it lays its eggs in other birds' nests, usually a much smaller species. The chick hatches, ejects all of the other eggs in that nest, and then an unrelated bird from a different species imprints on this bird and spends all this energy and time feeding this little imposter who's usually much bigger than these poor little birds that are kind of duped into caring for somebody else's offspring. That's where the term cuckoldry comes from. And cuckoldry has been a threat to male reproductive fitness across our history because women always know if a child is theirs, right? Men don't know that. And so a big evolutionary failure is raising another man's offspring. Mm-hmm. So ever since we have had laws, I mean, you know, certain behaviors to avoid cuckoldry have been you know, put into the penal code. In Texas, for example, in up until like 1973, men could be exonerated for killing their wife if he caught them cheating, you know, murdering her. So yes, I mean, a lot of our government reflects male evolutionary concerns. Another example is looking at when we measure political orientation across the world and rank it, you know, rank nations by how politically conservative they are, what we see is that the most politically conservative nations tend to be Islamic majority nations. And so, interestingly, we see the highest level of mate guarding in these countries. So mate guarding is where, males will guard their mates to prevent cuckoldry. They'll follow them around. I mean, we see this in other species. Follow them around, be very, jealous and protective, especially when their mates are in estrus.
Mm-hmm.
So in these nations, in Islamic nations, the science shows that you see the biggest gaps in gender equality, and a lot of these gaps have to do with mate guarding. So in many Islamic nations, you can't travel outside the home without a male guardian. You can't leave the country without permission from your male guardian. You can't leave the house without covering yourself in drapery so that you're not tempting to other men. And some cases, if you get raped, you can get killed for that. Well, this is all based on trying to defend against cuckoldry. Now, interestingly, too, in non-human animals, we see cuckoldry at its highest when there's a skewed sex ratio. So when you have like more, for example, more males in a population than females, mate guarding increases to deal with the surplus of rivals, right? So you mate guard because there's all these rivals trying to get in on your action. The biggest sex ratios in the world are in Islamic nations. So we see the same pattern among other animals, and I think people get a little wary when we bring up the topic of Islam, because they confuse looking at Islam as a political system, which I think all religions are, with Islamophobia, with being prejudiced against a person or a race. But religions are political systems, if nothing else. So that gives you an idea. And it's not just Islamic nations. I mean, like I said, in Texas, I mean, it was legal to murder your wife if you caught her cheating on you. So
yes, it's interesting that you refer to religion there, because I guess that when I was saying that people, or men specifically, tend to codify certain social norms that they create in terms of codes of law, and specifically also in terms of religious codes of conduct, let's say. So the religion also has a role to play there. And you refer to Islam. I guess that perhaps another very important aspect regarding Islam is that in those countries where we have a majority of Islamic people, the separation between church and state, does it really happen there, as we have at least in Western countries?
No, it's very poor, and that's a problem, because when you say, and part of it is that when there's poor separation between church and state, you cannot question the hierarchy. Questioning is forbidden. Well, you see these rules in the primate dominance hierarchy, where you don't question the alpha chimpanzee's rule unless you want to get attacked by that alpha chimp. So men have a way of codifying this into laws and rules where you literally don't question the hierarchy. Divine right of kings, for example, papal infallibility. You don't question the Pope's power, the Pope's authority, because in fact of his alliance with the most powerful male in the universe, right? Who frowns on questioning. He'll kill you for questioning, according to Scripture. So if you really believe that makes the idea of questioning the hierarchy terrifying. But then again, what I talk about in my first book is that how the gods of the Abrahamic faiths and of many religions worldwide, they tend to be based on alpha primate male imperatives, controlling sexuality, controlling territory, giving submission displays. So it's interesting that mostly the gods in these religions tend to have the same desires as the men who puppeteer them or represent them. I guess I should say, for the vicars, right?
Right.
They want you to give up sex. They want you to take vows of chastity.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting that we're talking about religion because religion has also been used throughout human history to justify certain very specific political actions that, when we're looking back at male psychology, really do seem to serve that kind of psychology, like, for example, war. Right.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. So just, I mean, case in point, I think it ties into what we were talking about. In the Old Testament, Moses ostensibly, at the order of God, commanded his men to go into the rival tribe, kill all the women, kill all the male children, and take the women that please you as your sexual spoils. So the alpha male in the sky that Moses was receiving his instructions from, was telling his men to do this. Well, this is male mate competition, basically. I mean, we see this imperative enacted across so many other species. So yes, I mean, all of this serves a militaristic function.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, we've been referring to liberal and conservative politics, but is it the case that perhaps in different social or ecological or environmental circumstances, perhaps these two types of political strategies might play a better role? I mean, according to the circumstances, perhaps in certain situations it's better for us to be conservative, and in other situations to be at least a little bit more liberal, or not.
Sure, that could be the case. There's evidence to suggest in our evolutionary past that times of hardship, times of resource scarcity really drove aggression. So it became kind of an arms race. So if in those times, it benefits your tribe to conduct raids on the outside tribe and take their resources. And because that benefits your fitness, right? It benefits you. So it becomes an arms race between tribes. The most militaristic survives that kind of experience. And it eliminates male competitors who are using resources in a certain territory. So we can deduce this from the strata, looking at periods of drought, and we can deduce this from looking at fossil remains where there was massacres. There's often starvation that we could see in the bones. So the question is, today, back then we were at nature's mercy, though. We were living as hunter gatherers, and if there was a drought, we were in trouble. If there was something that happened to the herds that we followed, we were in trouble. But today we can feed the world in excess if we really wanted to. We could eliminate starvation from the human experience. So does that militaristic imperative serve us to the same extent now that we have technology, that we don't really have to compete for food anymore? Not really. We've mastered food production. So that's a big question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, even from an evolutionary perspective, both strategies have survived, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't have liberal people or conservative people nowadays. So, I mean, probably they did survive because both strategies could be more or less useful in different circumstances. And since we as humans really occupied several different environmental niches, perhaps both of them survived because of that, because in certain situations it would be more favorable to us to be perhaps a little more open, and to be more open, for example, interbreeding and to communicate and establish relationships with other groups, other tribes, and in other situations perhaps to be a bit more protective and conservative and less open and things like that.
Well, sure, and one bit of research that really speaks to what you're talking about, and I just find this endlessly fascinating, is that when you look at our distance from the equator, you see a progressive liberalization in political views.
Right.
And if conservatism was evolved in part to help protect us from pathogens, that makes perfect sense, because the further you get away from the equator, where it's hotter, it's more home to pathogens, the germ load gets smaller, right? And women tend to be more sexually open the further you get away from the equator. Well, women are usually on the receiving ends of fluids in sexual intercourse, and they're probably more likely to get infected by a sexual partner. So sure, I mean, it makes sense how this evolved from the pressures of our ancestral past. But look, we're carrying around all of these impulses, that some of which are pretty destructive. Does it really serve us to have this fear of germs when we have maybe if there's a big outbreak of some kind, but when we have access to vaccines and antibiotics, especially because world leaders will manipulate us using these adaptations as a hook. So during World War II, the Nazi regime often referred to Jews as vermin.
Right.
Vermin carry disease.
Yeah, and they even use the same gas that they used in industry to kill pests in the gas chambers, right? Zyklon B, was it? I guess.
That's telling. Yeah. And so that rhetoric goes on and on and on. And even recently, Donald Trump once said that immigrants are coming to come in and infest our nation. I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically the idea. So does it really serve us to have these adaptations when they have such capacity for destruction? When the threats are manufactured, if the threats are real, that's fine. But often the threats are manufactured, and for political ends, and that's the thing. The threat. Donald Trump, for example, promised to protect us from the Mexican rapists that are going to come over our border, and but that's a manufactured threat. I mean, and what isn't asked often is who stands to benefit from that. How many billions of dollars in government contracts would go into building a border wall separating the United States from Mexico? Some people stand to gain incredible wealth off of the border wall, using that fear to get policy support for it. That's the thing. So we have to make all of this stuff more conscious. And I think that I talk about this in the book. There is research showing that people on the conservative end tend to be more credulous, more manipulable. Mm-hmm. And this is objective research. It's not just me saying that, especially when fear is used. So like many academics, I'm left of center, right? I admit that. But that really makes me mad. That really makes me feel protective over my countrymen who are on the conservative end, who are getting manipulated. They're getting manipulated. Mm-hmm. We have to know this research. We have to make it part of the conversation about who we are. We have to make it, the conversation about who we are politically. We should discuss religions through this lens. We should discuss everything through the lens of evolutionary science.
Yes, and I mean, even in today's political environment of more and more polarization over time, I guess that it is really crucial for us to talk about these things. Also because since we have these sort of coalitional psychology and because of our in-group, out-group dynamics, I guess that if people are infused with fear by the media and by politicians and things like that. That, I mean, if someone that is part of their political tribe comes up with a position that is even more extreme than the one they already had before, then I mean, at a certain point, before they feel fear and things like that. Over time, people move more and more to the extreme because
Sure.
they also start. They also start thinking that perhaps people who do not hold those extreme views are no longer part of their group, and they also have perhaps to put them aside and to think that they are not really liberals or conservatives, but part of the opposite side of the political spectrum. And that's also perhaps why we nowadays, and I'm also a liberal, but liberals nowadays tend to very quickly qualify someone as a racist or sexist or fascist, just because people perhaps question some of the dogma that is going around.
Absolutely. So I think you described that dynamic very clearly. Sure. Everything you just said. I mean, yes, I think badges of tribal identity, they can become more extreme and more extreme, and people from outside nations can use it to manipulate us, and that's something that is a signature concern of the right. So, for example, during the 2016 election, there were these Russian meme generators putting out all these memes through social media that really know what tends to trigger somebody on the left and what tends to trigger somebody on the right. The left has their own buttons too, issues of fairness, issues of equality. And so these were being funneled into social media in America, and really contributed to us literally fighting ourselves in the street, as we did when we all the protests came up after the 2016 election. So yeah, they can divide societies and cause nations to break down and stop functioning. Mm-hmm. And so we should understand it.
Mm-hmm. So you really do think that we can profit from this knowledge to perhaps try to counter this political polarization that we're witnessing, and even more perhaps in Western society nowadays? I mean, I'm asking you this because in other conversations that I've had for the show, for example, the one that I've had with Dr. Martin Daly, right at the end of the interview, I asked him if he thought that we could use this evolutionary knowledge, and if we simply communicated it to people and people knew a little bit more about how their minds function and things like that, if that would help in that case to reduce violence, and in this case to reduce political polarization. And he told me that he didn't really think that by itself would make much of a difference, but because he was sort of an environmental determinist, in the sense that he thought that the best strategy would be simply for us to change the conditions in our environments, and those would be the things that would lead people toward better behavior.
So was his argument that when environments are more predictable and safer, then people become more civil with one another? Is that kind of his take? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in the case we were talking about violence and how economic inequality leads to more violence, particularly among young men, because they are basically competing among themselves for sexual resources, in this case women, right, and things like that. And I asked him really if simply telling people about these evolutionary processes and what is really behind their actions, if that would help. And that was the answer that he gave me. So
that's a very interesting question. Well, I think that if we can ever get a handle on that, that has to be systematized in the public school system. We have to teach people about evolutionary science. We have to teach critical thinking, teach people about all their moral biases, but it should inform policy as well. There are people who create these environmental conditions where there is inequality by just manipulating the populace, right? In America, you have, again, billionaires that don't pay taxes. And you see vast differences between those on the top and those on the bottom. What impact does that have? But it should inform policy. It should inform legislation. So to give you one example, polygyny has been outlawed in a lot of places around the world. I think that's a pretty sensible strategy, because what we know is that in societies that are more polygynous, that where polygynous is legal, I should say, there's a higher frequency of revolutions, right? So who fights revolutions? Young men trying to break in to a mating market dominated by older established males. We see this in other species as well. So policy has to be informed by evolutionary science as well. So is that going to happen from the top down? Maybe not. Those in positions of authority have always had a vested interest in keeping the public ignorant. So we need to educate the public, and we need to hold those lawmakers and policymakers accountable using this knowledge. This knowledge is so neglected, but it's so crucial to functioning societies.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so perhaps just one last topic, because nowadays we also talk a lot about gender inequality, and I guess that since we're talking about politics, it would also be important to talk about the role of women in politics, because it has been dominated, as we've already talked about here, for many millennia by men, basically. And I guess that it seems to me that the data points toward when countries move in the progressive scale and they grant more and more rights to women, the percentage of women in politics tends to go up, right? But even so, it seems that men still tend to acquire or to hold most of the positions of power in society. And I guess that the other complication here, coming from the literature about what they call the gender paradox, where it seems that in countries where women have more rights and are able to go to university and work wherever they want, it seems that the differences in terms of occupational interests between men and women tend to go up. Curiously, that's why they call it the gender paradox. So, what can we do about this? There are people that propose quotas or higher quotas for women, but on the other hand, if women are really not that interested in holding these positions and occupations, what could be the best approach here?
Oh boy, you have to be very, very careful when you start imposing quotas. I think and boy, talk about a topic that gets people's hackles up. I can't wait to see your comments section when we talk about this, because that can be very threatening, especially to men who are programmed to no, we must have control. And what are you saying? You're feminizing the world. It's like you're trying to emasculate us. But the truth is, when women have more power, societies it becomes healthier and just better and more livable for everybody. Education increases, things like that. There's more fairness. Healthcare, access to healthcare increases. Look at the most societally healthy nations in the world, and there's ways to measure this. There are ways to measure societal health. Tend to afford women the most power, right? They tend to have more opportunities for women, more freedoms for women. And when women get into positions of power, they tend to, generally speaking, they tend to govern very differently than men. It tends to be more based on compassion.
Right.
Defense spending goes down, but only, I mean, usually when they're surrounded by same-sex peers. There is a trend that when women first start coming into politics, they tend to be more hawkish. Margaret Thatcher, Hillary Clinton, for example, tend to be more hawkish in their foreign policy. And so sometimes when we talk about this, people say, we'll point to these women like, well, what about them? They were kind of warlike. Well, yeah. So there's research looking at this. So in the absence of being surrounded by their same-sex peers, they're entering a male dominance hierarchy. And everybody knows when you enter a male dominance hierarchy, you got to prove yourself. You got to prove your toughness. But when women are surrounded in government by more of their same-sex peers, they tend to govern more, possibly in accordance with their evolved psychology. So, and something you were talking about as well is that, well, yes, but when women have greater freedoms, they tend to take jobs that are more, probably in keeping with their own. With their evolved psychology, like, I don't know, teaching or things that are maybe less STEM fields, things like that. So that's an interesting trend too. And I think the idea is that, when you provide for women, but with let's say paid maternity leave or state-funded healthcare, that makes it safer to do those kinds of things. It's not a dog-eat-dog kind of environment where women are forced into STEM fields just to try and feed themselves. So it's interesting. We have to look at all these dynamics. We have to examine them. We have to think about them and decide, hey, and really know that, hey, these sciences should inform policy. And there are some of our evolved tendencies that we should put thoughtful checks on. There's some that we should leash, and there's some that should have a greater expression.
Mm-hmm. But there certainly wouldn't be any simple solution to these problems, right? Because I mean, if the goal that certain people have, like for example, people who are more on the progressive side of the political spectrum, if they say that they would only consider a society to be perfectly gender equal if we had a perfect 50-50 distribution of men and women in positions of power, then, I mean, should we really expect that to happen, taking into account this gender paradox thing?
Yeah, well, yeah, so we can't like force women into positions, right? But maybe make them available. Sure. I mean, I don't think that would be. I don't think that's kind of morally acceptable either, to force somebody into a position. But I think how about opportunity? How about making that open? Or how about looking at the most destructive sides of male reproductive psychology and seeing how that plays out in government, seeing how that plays out in business and corporations, and putting limits on that and understanding that. We need to do that as well.
Mm-hmm. So perhaps we should focus more our discourse on getting more equality of opportunity instead of perhaps thinking that much about equality of outcome.
Yeah, so a la Jordan Peterson and what he's talking about. Yeah, sure, but I don't know. I think whatever we do, we have to take an empirical approach to that. Look at nations that do have quotas, see how they work, see if they work, see if that has an impact on societal health. See what impact quotas have, and see if they can be used judiciously or not. Whatever we do, it should be informed by research. Mm-hmm. That's what I think. I just think science is the best way to gather unbiased information, because it has mechanisms built in to help us avoid bias. So whatever we should do, it should be science-driven and thoughtful and rational, and not let the survivalistic, fear and aggression-based parts of the brain, take the wheel. Those should be, take a back seat and let the rational thinking intel parts of the brain start to drive. That's what I think.
Okay. So, Dr. Garcia, let's end on that note. But just before we go, would you like to tell people, apart from your books, what could be the best online resources if they want to get in touch with your work?
I think my website is probably the easiest way, hector-garcia.com, and you can also, there's a way to contact me through that as well. Yeah, that's probably the easiest, hector-garcia.com.
Okay. So I will be leaving all of that and also links to your books in the description box of the video. And so, Dr. Garcia, thank you again a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It was really a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you for this thoughtful conversation. Appreciate it.
Hi everybody, thank you so much for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics from a variety of fields. So just to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. If you don't like Patreon, you can also do it via PayPal and Subscribestar. All of the links will be in the description box. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my Patreons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litske, Anne Blanchett, Perel Galarson, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelina, Jim Frank, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Condreanu, Jana Enninen, and my first producer, Izar Webbe. Thank you for all.